Aragorn raced along the banks of the Anduin River in Parth Galen, near the falls of Rauros. It was early in 3019 of the Third Age, towards the end of the events of the Fellowship of the Ring. "Frodo! Where are you, my friend?" the ranger cried out. In the distance, there was the din of battle ringing throughout the trees. "No," Aragorn said softly to himself, and ran swiftly towards the sounds, coming closer to the inevitable battle at hand. That is when he heard the Horn of Gondor sound, and he knew Boromir was in danger. Aragorn ran even faster, but not before looking at the Anduin River one last time. There he saw a boat from Lothlorien, slowly moving over the waters. Behind the boat was a small figure, a hobbit, struggling to swim after the boat. In that moment, Aragorn had to make a decision. He could come to the aid of Boromir, a high warden and capable warrior of Gondor, or the aid of two hobbits that carried the fate of the world. If the Uruk-hai were to find them, it would spell doom for the world. Thus, Aragorn chose the latter, opting to go to his hobbit friends and defend them from any danger. He called aloud to them, and he almost immediately regretted it. Aragorn could feel a shift in the woods, and now there were thunderous boots making their way towards him. He drew Anduril, the Flame of the West, and made ready to defend the hobbits. But Uruk after Uruk spilled forth from the forests of eastern Rohan, and Aragorn could not take them all. He did what he could, but it was not enough, and he was overwhelmed to do anything besides defend himself. He looked towards Frodo and Sam, who were now both on the boat headed for the eastern shore. Aragorn felt some relief, and he felt as though they would make it, for the Uruks did not want to swim after their quarry and pursue them onto the eastern shore. His hope soon turned to ash when he heard the Uruk-hai speak. A leader yelled, "If we can't capture them alive, Saruman would have to accept them dead. Knock your arrows!" Roughly 10 Uruk-hai archers and crossbowmen made ready to fire, and before Aragorn could intervene, the commander issued a volley. Aragorn watched in terror as his beloved friends were slain by the servants of the White Hand. A fury took him then, and as Legolas and Gimli sprang forth from the forest, Aragorn had already slain all of his enemies. The ranger then waded out into the flowing waters of the river, and he swam for the boat of Lorien, before it could be swept away over the waterfalls. Within half an hour, Aragorn had climbed into the boat and paddled it back to shore. When the boat was ashore and the battle was over, the three companions, Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli, wept for their fellowship. Frodo, Sam, and Boromir were slain, and Pippin and Merry were captured. After the fallen were sent over the falls in the boats and they were mourned, the choice for a new ring-bearer had to be made. Even between these three valiant friends, the choice was difficult. Arguments broke out between the elf and dwarf, as each argued as their kindreds had for ages. Then Aragorn broke the discourse by deeming that he would carry it as Isildur did long before him, and it was now his burden more than it was anyone else's. Gimli and Legolas agreed with some measure of discontent, but the matter was settled. Aragorn took the chain and the ring, and put it on beneath his cloak from the Galadrium. Though it had no seemingly visible effect on Aragorn at first, the descendant of Númenor felt power, fire, and anger. Anger for what had been done to his friends, and fury towards the Dark Lord for his many deeds over the long ages. The three decided to pursue Merry and Pippin, and said it may be possible for one of them to take up the ring after they were rescued, for it was said that the hobbits were the least susceptible to the powers of the artifact. While the man did not wear the ring upon his finger yet, it gave him strength and fury while bearing it, as it may have done for Isildur before the disaster of the Gladden Fields. Eventually, Aragorn outran his companions, and told them to meet him and the hobbits at the edge of the Fangorn forest. Legolas and Gimli agreed, and Aragorn was off. He ran across the Eastment with the speed of a prancing horse, and he came upon the remaining Uruk-hai earlier than in the original story. When night came on February 27th of 3019 of the Third Age, Aragorn made ready to sneak past the servants of Saruman to rescue his friends. After they were safe in the Fangorn, he would return to pick off his enemies one by one. When morning came, the band would have been destroyed, and so Aragorn went forth with his plan, using his skills as a ranger to liberate Merry and Pippin without the notice of the Uruk-hai, who argued about eating the hobbits. But after the hobbits were safe in the forest, Aragorn heard the sound of battle and horses. The Rohirrim had come under the leadership of Éomer, under the cover of night, and they decimated the Uruk-hai. Aragorn and his friends watched the battle, and afterwards, Aragorn alone introduced himself to the riders, bringing forth Andúril and Hope, while the hobbits were to make camp in the Fangorn and were supposed to await Gimli and Legolas if Aragorn did not return. During this conversation, Merry and Pippin explored the edge of Fangorn, and they came across Treebeard, who would take them to Gandalf the White. From here, their story would remain mostly the same until after the destruction of Isengard. After some dialogue took place, Aragorn asked for a horse so that he may ride to fulfill more of his destiny. Although Aragorn only had possession of the ring for a short amount of time, it gave him the strength of will to act with more power and passion in pursuit of his desires. But already he acted with less wisdom and forethought. Éomer gave him the horse Hasufel, whose master had fallen in battle, and Aragorn told Éomer to look for the coming of an elf and a dwarf. He told Éomer to tell the two hunters that their friends were safe within the Fangorn. They should reunite with their friends before going to Edoras to give aid to Rohan. Finally, he told Éomer to tell Legolas and Gimli that Aragorn would see them soon, and he would bring help and victory. With that, Aragorn rode south with haste, and although the Rohirrim were inspired, Éomer sensed some dread about the ranger that he could not quite understand, but he remained true to Aragorn's requests. Meanwhile, Aragorn rode indeed towards his destiny with the winds of fate. He passed Edoras and then Underharrow, finally coming to Dunharrow and the Paths of the Dead. As he had pursued the Uruk-hai, he thought of the past. He thought of how the wild men of the White Mountains had betrayed his forefather Isildur in their fight against Sauron long before, and he felt that it was time they fulfilled their oaths at last. And so Aragorn bade Hasufel remain in his service and wait for him in Dunharrow. The horse obeyed its new master and his strange powers of dominance. Aragorn went forth into the darkness of the Paths of the Dead alone, with courage in his sword and tyranny in his ring. As for Legolas and Gimli, once they found the edge of the Fangorn and Éomer's riders, they were told of Aragorn and his message. The two wondered at Aragorn's sudden haste and strength, and they knew that the One Ring must have had something to do with it. They feared for their friend, but believed in him as well. And so they searched the Fangorn for Merry and Pippin, but instead they found Gandalf the White, as they do in the original timeline. The three held council, and Gandalf was ill prepared for what he heard. The deaths of Frodo, Sam, and Boromir weighed on him heavily, and he felt responsible. More so, he feared for Aragorn, and knew that he may become corrupted by Sauron's ring. The wizard knew that if there was any man with the strength enough to wield the One, it was Aragorn, but nevertheless it scared him still. Even so, the wizard set out with Legolas and Gimli for Edoras, Gandalf and Gimli upon Shadowfax, and Legolas upon Arod, the horse given to him by Éomer. They were to free Theoden as is done in the books, and Rohan made ready to battle Saruman. The Rohirrim would be pushed back into Helm's Deep, and the battle was roughly the same as it was in the original timeline, until dawn came. Gandalf had found Erkenbrand and his riders to help Rohan, yes, but there was also another army on the field. Unlooked for, from the east came Aragorn upon Hasufel, with the host of the dead at his back. They charged, and the battle was easily won, for many Uruk-hai and Dunlendings dropped their weapons at the sight of the dead and made for the Forest of Ents. After the battle ended, Aragorn and Gandalf were reunited, and Aragorn was glad at his friend's return to life. Gandalf spoke of his worries to Aragorn about the ring, but the heir of Isildur said that he felt stronger and more alive than ever. But the wizard kept his worries, telling him that once the war was over, the ring would have to be destroyed. Aragorn agreed, for now. Finally, before Theoden and the others set off to speak to Saruman at Isengard, the Oathbreakers looked to Aragorn and asked to be released from their oaths, as they had followed him from the Stone of Arrak and did his bidding to fight. But instead, Aragorn laughed at this request. The man yelled, "You Oathbreakers must see your promises totally fulfilled, before I shall consider the request. Your betrayal and years of absence to service must be repaid tenfold." The Oathbreakers were angry, and they made ready to attack Aragorn. But there, in front of Helm's Deep, Aragorn put on the One Ring, and while he vanished from view of his allies among the living, the dead could see the fearsome spirit of Aragorn in the Shadow Realm. The shades of the Men of the Mountain felt fear for the first time in an age, and their wills broke upon Aragorn's. They would follow him. Aragorn took the ring off and placed it back onto its chain. He claimed that it had been necessary when Gandalf scolded him, and he was too arrogant to be dissuaded from the folly of his actions. The Free Peoples, however, were joyous that they would have the help of the dead for the rest of the war, and they continued on to Isengard. Saruman was made to talk even more here, as even in all of his power, the army of the dead frightened him. He was even persuaded to come down from his tower, as was Wormtongue, and they were made prisoners of the Free Peoples. Merry and Pippin rejoined the company as well. Aragorn thus took the Orthanc Stone from Isengard, the palantir that Saruman used. With it, the future king spoke to Sauron directly, showing the Dark Lord that he possessed the One Ring and an army of dead men, saying that he was coming now for Sauron. Even the Dark Lord was disturbed by this. Thus Aragorn and the others among the Free Peoples set out for the east, knowing that Gondor would be under siege soon. Rohan mustered its riders and went with the army of the dead to Gondor. The remaining members of the Fellowship went together to Minas Tirith, and the idea of the One Ring being removed from Aragorn to give to one of the hobbits was discussed lightly, but Aragorn always refused the notion, claiming that it was his burden. And so, during the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, many lives were saved, for the Rohirrim and the Oathbreakers came in the hour of Gondor's most dire need, and saved them from destruction. But, since Gandalf and Pippin had not ridden ahead, because Pippin never looked into the Palantir, Denethor and Faramir were both slain. The latter by a Nazgul before the gates of the city, and the former by fire of his own making. The line of stewards ended ere the Battle of the Pelennor Fields took place. Thus, before Aragorn and his armies of Gondorians, Rohirrim, and Oathbreakers moved on to fight Sauron, Aragorn claimed the mantle of kingship over Gondor and Arnor. And so King Elessar, the Lord of the Rings, led the men of the West to the Black Gate, and after Aragorn slew the mouth of Sauron for his service to the Dark Lord, unlike the original timeline, the armies poured forth out of the Black Gate. To ensure the victory of the West, Aragorn put the One Ring on, and using stealth and strength, and proved senses and his tyranny over the Oathbreakers, the host of the West had easy victory over Sauron, and the Dark Lord's armies fled back to Barad-dûr. Using siege weapons, the armies of the West forced Sauron to come forth from his tower. Sauron challenged Aragorn to a duel, but Aragorn refused and bade his archers fire upon Sauron. He knew that the One Ring would betray him as it did to Isildur, and Sauron would somehow win the fight and be reunited with his ring. After many arrows pierced Sauron and the Dark Lord was upon his knees, Aragorn took joy in these moments. He took off the One Ring and put it back onto its chain, so all could see him in his moment of triumph. He said Sauron would be punished for all of his deeds, spanning from the Elder Days to the end of the Third Age. Aragorn had learned from his distant relation Ar-Pharazôn, and he knew Sauron would have to be defeated each and every time he came back. He could never be trusted. And so, Aragorn plunged his sword through Sauron's chest, ending the Dark Lord temporarily, for the One Ring yet remained. He then called for the execution of their prisoner Saruman, and he would commence the punishment after returning to Minas Tirith, where Saruman was being held. Gandalf was scared, and knew that it was too late. Aragorn had grown too powerful, and the ring had overcome him. Aragorn named himself King Elessar, taking after the Númenórean kings of old, and he bade all kneel before him, for with the power of the One Ring, the reign of ancient Númenor would be restored, although the island could not be. Gandalf cried out against him, pleading with him to keep his promise to destroy the One Ring, as Sauron was defeated and Mount Doom was so near. Aragorn laughed, an evil, dark laughter, and demanded his men of Gondor arrest Gandalf, who would be forever a prisoner of men. They did so against their will, while Aragorn put the One Ring upon his finger once again. From that moment on, King Elessar became the new Lord of the world. Gondor and Arnor would expand outward and claim dominion over all. Even Rohan, who would rebel against Aragorn's tyranny, would be conquered, for Elessar's ring provided him the will to dominate and control all life. The hobbits would be enslaved, as would the elves and dwarves that did not sail west, flee, or die resisting. The men of the reunited kingdom of Númenor would follow their king Elessar into the Fourth Age, the Age of Men. Aragorn would use his ring to command the Oathbreakers until the end of his life, for they became the fist of the king. Arwen would leave the shores, so Aragorn would marry someone else, and their son Aldarion would continue the new rise of reunited Númenor, as the One Ring would come to him and pass to his son and so forth. Thus the Age of Sauron would be over, for his forces would remain too weak to rise again, and the Age of Men would be just as cruel if Aragorn had taken the One Ring for himself. Hey guys, Yoiston here, and I hope you all enjoyed today's new theory video. If you did, please hit that like button and share this with a friend. It is indeed a sad and terrible tale, for nothing but more tyranny would have come from Aragorn taking the One Ring. But just like with every theory, this is just one way it could go, and there are many other possible directions the story could take. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Would it have happened like this or differently? Please check out our Facebook, Twitter, and merch in the description, and also please consider donating to our Patreon. Just $1 a month will get you access to our channel's podcast and Discord server. Finally, don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell to join the Men of the West and all of the Free Peoples today. I'll see you all again next week with a video on the houses of the elves in Middle-earth, so I hope you all look forward to that. As always, everyone, thank you all so much for your love and support, and for joining me on this adventure. Until the next one, my valiant friends.